GB is in constitutional limbo, so there's no mention of it in Pakistan's constitution. And as such, the people there, approximately about a population of 2 million people, have no meaningful political and economic or constitutional rights. GB is home to more than 7,000 glaciers, which is the biggest single location of glaciers outside of the Arctic regions, outside of the poles. And it's only when the next horrific incident comes to the surface that we're like, oh no, we have to do something about this. But in the meantime, the rot, as I said, a hydra-headed monster, becomes more and more entrenched. And I think some of our debate, these are deep-seated views and forms of power that are articulated in our society by men or young boys, who themselves, by the way, are not immune to the fallouts of patriarchy.
The patriarchy is overdetermined by both economic and non-economic factors. So. Hello friends, welcome to Fiscal Focus on DawnNews English. This is Danish Khan, and today I'm joined by Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar. He's professor at Quaid-e-Azam University, and he writes about political, economic, and development issues pertaining to Pakistan. Thank you, Aasim, for joining me today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I recently read your piece in Dawn about Land Reforms Act in Gilgit-Baltistan, and Gilgit-Baltistan remains beyond the imaginary of mainland Pakistan because it's less discussed and also less understood. So tell us about Gilgit-Baltistan, or GB short, because in the mainland Pakistan, GB is only seen as a tourist destination.
Yeah, very briefly, basically, GB is clumped together as part of the so-called Kashmir dispute. And, just by saying that, actually sort of in a sense glosses over the fact that this is a distinct region with distinct history and culture. But because it's clumped together with the Kashmir dispute, sort of as sort of the greater Kashmir area, what that has meant is that actually GB is in constitutional limbo. So there's no mention of it in Pakistan's constitution. And as such, the people there, approximately about a population of 2 million people, have no meaningful political and economic or constitutional rights. But as you say, nevertheless, it, like many other peripheries in Pakistan, like Balochistan, or you could have many more examples. The people of the region may not matter to those in power, but the resources of the region do. The fact that it's the gateway. Some of your listeners will know that the Karakoram Highway was built that allowed there to be sort of an overland route to the Chinese border. And it is the sort of gateway to CPEC as well. So really, it's a region where, in a sense, you have the suspension of people's rights, but the resources and the land and the access routes are considered fair game. And just to close, the piece that I wrote was about something called as you said, the Land Reform Act. Ironically, the term land reform, I think for most progressives, would tend to refer to, some kind of redistributive measure where you sort of break up concentrated land holdings and you redistribute amongst those who don't have land. And that, even in the economics literature, is generally considered to give rise to more productivity and so on. But here, in this case, the Land Reform Act is this sort of strange bill, which is essentially giving the rights to state or the administrators of GB to determine different legal categories of land. And in regions like GB, you have large amounts of land which are not privately owned or do not classically fall into the categories of private or public ownership, but are common property resources. And so really, the Land Reform Act is giving a lot of power to administrators to determine how to classify this land. And local people in GB are very concerned that this will mean more sort of expropriation, more arbitrary decision-making, more outsiders coming in to own resources, which, like many such peripheries, gives rise to concerns about demographic change, about further erosion of political and economic rights. So yeah, as you say, it's not just a tourist destination. There's a lot more going on. And I think, and lastly, in fact, perhaps as important as anything else, this is, of course, the lifeline of the Indus River system.
Mm,
GB is home to more than 7,000 glaciers, which is the biggest single location of glaciers outside of the Arctic regions, outside of the poles. And it is this seasonal glacier melt which gives the Indus its water, which goes all the way down to the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. And those glaciers are now not just seasonally melting, they're permanently melting, which is giving rise in the short term to floods, but in the long run means drying up of water entirely.
So to further understand, so what's the pretext taken by the government to undertake these land reforms? Is it on the name of development? Because I know in the context of national parks, the argument was to preserve natural habitat, right? So conservation. And what's the pretext this time?
Well, the pretext is, as I said, that these are sort of, if you, again, some of your listeners will know under the British, and GB was also subject to British colonial rule. The British basically did in most parts of India where they directly ruled India, they settled what they called settlement reports. So they basically surveyed and measured every little inch of land and then, created a property rights regime and said, okay, this is owned by this person, this is owned by the state, this is common property. And in some of the indirectly ruled regions, of which GB is one, the so-called princely states, some of this land settlement, or in fact, large amounts of land, was never formally classified or settled. So the argument is, well, this is a long-term exercise that has been waiting to happen. There's a lot of disputes. There's a lot of, uncertainty about which land belongs to whom. And even though I don't think that that's how the local people see it, because common property doesn't belong to anyone. That's the whole point. It's commonly used, and there's sort of customary sort of rules. So I don't think that this was sort of a popular demand necessarily as much as sort of, again, the state determining or directing a particular regime of development, as you note. And it's also important to note that, like in KP and Balochistan, where recently we've had these very rapidly rushed through legislations around mines and minerals, GB is also home to a lot of minerals. So I think there's a lot beneath the surface that is not disclosed when you sort of have this vague explanation. Well, we need to settle the land and we need to resolve these outstanding questions of, which land belongs to whom. Whereas, in fact, I think local people see it very differently, that, they would like to retain many common property regimes, certainly maybe codify those regimes, but not in a way that it's done by fiat from above, but democratically, which, of course, as I noted at the outset, is not possible because GB has no constitutional rights.
Now, and this, if we connect it with the broader discussion in development economics, where we have two options, either privately owned property or the state-owned property, right? But here, as you allude to, there's an alternative which has been operating in many peripheral or societies in the global south, such as community-owned and managed land holdings. And that's where in GB, it was not privately owned, neither owned by state, but communities, self-governed and organized. And it has led to one of the most richest biodiversity anywhere in the region, thanks to the community-owned and managed landscapes. So people are upset because it's going to impact their livelihoods. Is that also one of the key aspects of this?
For sure. I think that it's going to impact sort of in a broad sense, how these mineral-rich regions, of which GB is one, whether it's land, of course, as I noted, water resources with the glaciers, and minerals. I mean, how are these new sort of exploratory regimes around the world under the guise of development? People, I think, are right to be suspicious about the fact that, well, we have a lot of, sort of very valuable resources on what is our land. but we are not being allowed to determine how those are used. And this is a basic question of self-determination, as much as it is about a right to determine how to use local resources. And this is, again, this GB is not alone in this respect in Pakistan or even around the world. And I think the question of suspicions is not just about perception. I think it is also based on previous lived experiences. So it's not as if previous developmental regimes, whether it has to do with road building or, as you say, tourist resorts or hotel building, have not engendered conflicts between sort of profiteers from the outside, including some local middlemen, and even state personnel, and then local people on the other hand. So I think that it's based on these lived experiences that there's this feeling that this is now under the guise of the so-called Land Reform Act, is going to be given legal cover in a sense. A regime of expropriation is going to be given legal cover. And as you rightly note, this is not just about local resources and their use as livelihoods. It's also about future generations. It's also about, local ecologies. And mind you, the irony here is the people who make decisions for us are planners and our strategic spy masters. I mean, the irony is that, of course, GB supplies all of our water. So this is not just something that is about GB's people, after all. It's also about the long-term effects of unbridled exploitation and expropriation of resources from a region which has, over thousands, in fact, hundreds of thousands of years, supported the Indus sort of basin. And we already know that the Indus basin is struggling, and downstream in Sindh, there is no water, or there's a great shortage of water because of so much diversion upstream. And that's aside from glacier melt. So I think that there's a lot of underlying, really serious structural concerns that explain the suspicion and the opposition to this act. But at the heart of it is just the fact that where I started, that if you have a region where you have 2 million people who are disenfranchised, then they have no means to articulate within any kind of democratic framework the desire to resolve such matters, which are complex. Anywhere in the world they would be complex. They're no less complex in GB. The question is, if you've not created any democratic procedures, in fact, you don't even mention the region in the constitution. I think that is ultimately where the rot starts. And then, of course, it extends into many other realms.
Now, moving on to our next topic, as you are aware that it's a budget season in Pakistan and it's seen as one of the key exercises in terms of the government spending and projections about the future, and also more about the sentiment and confidence among consumers, investors, and average folks about the economy. There's a lot of talk about inflation being under control, being less than 5%, and growth has been steady. You are in Islamabad right now. How do you see average folks are being impacted by the economic stability or macro stability?
Yeah, well, I don't know who would use stability in their right mind. I mean, it's the stabilization of hardship and poverty, really, is what we've seen. Yes, of course, inflation, which was in double digits, in fact, touching 30% for the best part of 2 years, has come down. But even in the classical, economics literature, inflation is always measured alongside one other variable, unemployment. And it's interesting to me that in the economic survey, which, as you know, precedes the publishing of which precedes the budget, there's no unemployment figures. It's quite stunning that you actually have a document that the government is putting out where it's not because they don't have figures. I mean, yes, there's another debate about the extent to which the formal economy and all figures, whether it be inflation or unemployment or all of the other, forex or growth figures, whether they actually accurately capture the reality of Pakistan's economy, which, like many in post-colonial world, is highly informalized. But even if you sort of put that aside for a second, the fact that there's no formal unemployment figures, because in my estimation, unemployment is well in the double digits, probably above 20%. And if you add underemployment to the story, where people are just eking out precarious forms of living on a daily basis, then you're probably talking 30, 40%. Now, that is a shocker that we're not even acknowledging that. So whether in Islamabad or in the rural peripheries, I think the situation is dire. And the other thing I will note, which we might come to, is that the one thing that the government has acknowledged is that agriculture is in a state of utter distress. And again, incredibly, they'll acknowledge that. They'll say major crop yields have declined, input prices have increased, and at the same time, based on IMF conditionalities, they've withdrawn over a number of years now, but it's this year it's been, in a sense, cemented. They've withdrawn the fundamental subsidy that small and landless farmers have always benefited from, which is a food support price,
Mm.
which means irrespective of the amount of money you spend tilling your crop, the government buys it on a minimum price so that at least you can make ends meet. Now that's been completely repealed entirely as well. So they're admitting some things, they're completely ignoring other things. And that I think that to me confirms that economic hardship is the name of the game. And whether the figures that they're quoting or maybe even multilaterals are quoting reflect that or not, I think the reality when you look around you and you can see that people are really, really struggling.
And you mentioned unemployment and the conventional wisdom based on Phillips curve is that there's an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. And if inflation is declining, it's probably at the cost of unemployment. And that's the trade-off. Of course, it's not always true, but given the central bank, the State Bank of Pakistan has been raising interest rates, which leads to decline in investments, which may lead to layoffs and more unemployment. That's the standard story because numbers are not given, so we assume that's the case. Now, there's also a lot of talk about uh, the debt servicing, and that seems to be the largest part of the budget. Now, given this constraint, what are the options the federal government have? Or what can they do in order to avoid this trap?
Yeah, no, there's no avoidance, and there's been no avoidance for, a couple of decades now. In fact, the debt repayment burden is reached really unprecedented proportions. On average, over the next 3 fiscal years, we are scheduled to pay back $25 billion a year. And again, if you go into the fine print, that's not even sort of principals. These are mostly interest payments that have accrued over the decades. We are now in a situation where we have a lot of debt that we owe to bilateral donors and multilateral donors. But in fact, we've started taking more debt from commercial banks
Mm.
to pay back the bilateral and multilaterals. And most of our bilateral donors, the best we can hope for, you hear in the news every second or third day, is some kind of rollover, which basically means that they've just extended the amount of time that we have to pay them back. So there is no getting away from this. And it's on the basis of this crippling debt burden that everything else is being shaped. The fact that they're rolling back subsidies, the fact that they're trying to say we're extending the tax net, but again, they're just taxing those who have no option but to pay tax. They're not taxing the rich, they're not taxing themselves, let's put it that way. So I don't think that in the short run there is a solution. That's why, for me, it's always about trying to bring into the debate the long run sort of causes of why we are so indebted. Why are we in an economy that is perpetually in deficit, is perpetually struggling? In fact, the gap between what we import and export has increased. The gap between, what we bring in as revenues and what our expenditures has also increased. And I think this is about, basically a highly class and regionally, in a sense, uneven economy, which has historic, and then also the additional factor, sort of enmity with our neighbors, which has also contributed to a high level of unproductive expenditure. And so, you put those all together, and I don't think you can fix the debt problem on its own. I think you need to go to the source, in a sense, and think about the long-term structural features, whether it be the way assets, land included, are distributed, the fact that those who have all of these assets don't pay tax, the fact that you have new sectors like real estate, which is immensely profitable, which is all speculative, which generates no jobs, which dispossesses, farmers and some slum dwellers alike, but they pay virtually no tax. the fact that, even our industries, whatever limited industrial base we have, are all low value industries like textiles, rice, ghee, and we are never going to be able to cover the cost of imports. In fact, our biggest export, as you know, is labor. So essentially, the biggest thing we make money from is sending, working class people abroad rather than actually something concrete like a real thing. So these are deep structural sort of ills, and debt is a reflection of that. And then because the creditors acquire so much power on the basis of the fact that we have to pay them back, then we just go into this cycle of austerity, right? So basically, this, like all the other budgets of the last some years, is an austerity budget, and they're giving us a lot of flashy figures to make it appear like things are going well, but really they're putting all the burden onto the most vulnerable, onto working class majority of the population, and it's really, in a sense, literally business as usual.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the agriculture is in decline, large scale manufacturing is decline, but if you turn on any Pakistani news channel or TV show, you'll notice a lot of ads about the housing societies or gated enclaves. That's the only sector which seems to be growing, although it is also slowing down given its recent the recent um, in the recent past, the growth was really fast, but now it's slowing down. But still, that's the only sector where new investments are coming in. Now, in the recent piece, you talk about patriarchy in Pakistan and you connected it with the horrific murder of young female YouTuber Sana Yusuf. And it's horrific, but where we expected universal condemnation of this incident, we saw varied response. So, how do you analyze this?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, maybe it sounds like it's a bit of a stretch, but I think this relates very well to all of the other things we've been talking about. This is a country, a society which is, highly classed and uneven, and where the peripheries have always been denied their rights. And by the same token, this is a society that is highly patriarchal, in which at least half the population is basically not even, I wouldn't even call them a second-class citizen. I think are in many cases are struggling to even gain basic human freedoms. And we've seen this so many times in the recent past because of the disclosures that I think now are becoming more common. That this is basically, I would call it an epidemic, right? Where you have young girls, women, even Khwaja Siraz, constantly dealing with all sorts of violence. And then, as you noted, when an incident like this actually happens, which is commonplace, remarkably or quite, in a sense, disgustingly, you have a large proportion of the online population, because I think that's where a lot of these debates and responses are expressed in real time, actually blame the victim, essentially say, well, all of this is on that young, 17-year-old girl, because the content that she produced on her whatever social media pages was provocative or lurid or whatever, inappropriate. And I think, again, this is not the only country in the world that you see this. Whether it be in the so-called advanced countries where you have a president in the US who is openly known as a harasser and groper, or even next door in India. I mean, the only bright spot in our region is Bangladesh, which probably has performed much better in terms of gender mobility within limits. Yes. So I think that's what patriarchy is, and I think patriarchy is in a sense, is like a triple-headed monster, along with capitalism and militarism. And I think they all reinforce one another. And I think that, the frustrations of a badly performing economy are taken out by young men on women because they are easy targets, whether they do it in the home, whether they do it to a famous TikToker who is murdered, or whether they live vicariously, through some kind of militaristic adventure somewhere far away. And it's in that faraway place that, the weak women and children are targeted. Um, these are all things that we see happening more and more on our screens, and we see this, and I think that it should be alarming to think that a brutalized, disenfranchised, increasingly marginalized population is in fact responding to their hardship in increasingly brutalized ways, right? Whether it be by brutalizing young women, or there could be a host of other examples. So it is, I think, in a sense, my feeling, however, is that we go from event to event, incident to incident, and then the news cycle takes over, and then we forget. And then it's only when the next incident, horrific incident, comes to the surface that we're like, oh no, we have to do something about this. But in the meantime, the rot, as I said, a hydra-headed monster, becomes more and more entrenched. And I think some of our debate, unlike what we're doing here, most of the debate is very so superficial, very surface level. And that's why the depths of the structural problems are never really interrogated, and we just react to individual events. And I think that means the problem is getting deeper, and we are not really talking about or identifying what we need to do in the long run. Because like the economy, there's no short-term solution here, right? These are deep-seated views and forms of power that are articulated in our society by men or young boys who themselves, by the way, are not immune to the fallouts of patriarchy. It's not as if young boys. In fact, for instance, we hear every day of young boys being abused by clerics. I mean, this is also something that happens in our society all the time. So it's not as if they're immune, but as I said, they themselves are brutalized, and then they take out their frustrations on sort of genders that are even more oppressed than them.
Yes, I mean, you rightly put it out. The patriarchy is overdetermined by both economic and non-economic factors. So thank you, Asim, for sharing your perspective. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in. Until next time, this is Danish Khan signing off from Dawn News English.